Okay, we're continuing here talking about chapter 8, the parables. We're on slide number 7. Just so you know, I modified this PowerPoint a little bit, eliminated a few things here. So if you're doing this and you want an updated version of the chapter 8 PowerPoint, just send me an email at pastoreric@lmcc.church. Okay, let's talk about the nature of the parables, the variety of kinds. Not all parables are of the same kind. We kind of talked about that the last time. A true parable that's kind of like almost like a little short story is the Good Samaritan. Okay, it's a true parable because it's a story with a beginning and an ending. It has something of a plot. Okay, other examples of true parables would be the lost sheep, the prodigal son, the great banquet, the workers in the vineyard, the rich man and Lazarus, and the 10 virgins. Okay, these are all what we consider true parables, and then there's derivatives of them. If you go to the next slide, slide number 8, other parables. Okay, you have what's called a similitude. That is the yeast and the dough. The kingdom of God is like yeast, right, that worked its way throughout the whole batch, trying to show how the kingdom, though it starts very, very small, ends up working its way through the whole world. And again, Christianity is a global faith, well over 1 billion, or is it 2 billion now, strong. Okay, in other words, that what Jesus said in that parable is exactly what's happened. Okay, what is said of the yeast or the sower or the mustard seed in some of these parables was always true of the yeast slowing or mustard seeds. In other words, these parables are a lot like illustrations in everyday life. Okay, they make a point. Some parables are actually metaphors, like you are the salt of the earth. Okay, that's an example of a metaphor. They're also what is called an epigram. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Okay, so because parables are not of one kind, we cannot lay down rules that cover them all. So what we're going to say here in the next few slides is for parables proper. Again, you know, the prodigal son, the parable of the vineyard and things like that. Although a lot of these will apply to metaphors and epigrams and things like that, okay? So if you go to slide number 9, how they function, okay? The best clue to understand what a parable is look at its function. Okay? Story parables do not serve to illustrate Jesus' teaching with word pictures, but story parables function as what they're trying to do is call forth a response. You're supposed to get kind of caught up in the story. Okay, think of the prodigal son. You get caught up in that whole story, and then the ending is kind of like a zinger. You know, perhaps it ends in a way that you didn't expect. It's trying to illustrate a teaching, if you will, something of a concept in a story form that kind of gets you caught up in that story and then hits you emotionally, if you will, with the ending. Okay, that's the idea. So it's calling forth some form of a response, and they liken it to a joke. You know, obviously the best jokes are the ones where, you know, the ending hits you out of the blue. You didn't see it coming, you didn't expect it, and suddenly now that's what makes the joke really, really funny. Okay, so that's the idea. So in understanding parables, the hermeneutical task is trying to, again, go back in time, put yourself in the same situation as the original recipients and hear it the way they did. Again, this is where, again, understanding some culture and historical background of the first century Greco-Roman Hellenized world can be really, really helpful because, again, then you can get hit with the impact and import of that particular parable in the way that they did. If you don't do that, you're not going to get it, okay? It's just like hearing a joke and everyone in the room gets it and you don't get it, okay? That's kind of this idea of not immersing yourself in the cultural and historical background of the first century world. So they give some examples here. If you go to slide number 11, they're talking about the parable in Luke 7, verse 40, about Jesus going to Simon's house. And talking about the two different debtors, one that owed somebody a little bit of money and then one that owed somebody just a ton of money. Okay, and if you're familiar with that parable, the individual that was much more responsive and thankful and grateful and offering up more praise was the individual that had a huge debt forgiven. And again, they're contrasting that with Simon, who was a Pharisee, a self-righteous guy who thought everything was fine, and then this woman who was a sinful woman. And again, the self-righteous Pharisee, of course, did not think that he needed to give a lot of to be grateful to God, or to even to express his love towards God, because he basically figured out life himself. He was so self-righteous, it was almost as if he didn't need God, because he had this thing going, right? He had everything figured out. Whereas in the case of the sinful woman, she understood her sinful nature. She understood that unless the Lord extended grace, she was in a world of hurt, in the same way like the individual who was forgiven by, of a huge debt. Okay, in other words, they're trying to. Jesus told that story because he was trying to get Simon caught up in it, in answering, the guy that was forgiven much is going to love a lot more. And that's where Jesus kind of nails him, okay? And so the parable it's a word of judgment, if you go to slide number 12, calling for response from Simon. Of course, when it's over, he's got egg all over his face, right? He got nailed because he did not realize that Jesus was talking about him, okay? So in other words, that's what these parables do. Okay, and one of the ways you start understanding these parables, if you go to slide number 13, is start looking for points of reference. Okay, the points of reference in this particular parable. You had debtor number 1, debtor number 2, and then of course the creditor. Right? These are points of reference that you're hanging the story on, and you start seeing this as these are the important points. Again, remember, as I've said many times before, these parables and these teachings of Jesus were delivered orally, right? It wasn't written down at the time. So they were given orally in a way to capture the hearer's imagination in a powerful way, because you're trying to get their response. So if you go to slide number 14, again, we're talking about how we understand these parables. Consider the audience if you can. Sometimes the parables are contextless. So you don't really have a context, you don't have a background, you don't see the audience that is hearing the particular parable, but sometimes you do, okay? And so when you do have an audience, try to listen and read the parable over and over again. Try to find the points of reference intended by Jesus that it would have been picked up by the original hearers, okay? And then try to identify and determine how the original hearers would have identified with the story and what they would have heard, okay? Because they, back in that day, they had something called debtor's prison, right? Is that you stayed in prison until you paid the very last penny, which you're thinking, well, how can I earn a living if I'm in prison, right? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? That was that's the social climate back then. So when this, when Simon is hearing this, and there was a debt that this debtor could never repay, it had greater import than perhaps what we have today. So again, you got to think those types of things through. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll begin with slide number 15.